The cruelest thing war ever did was convince people that a uniform, or the lack of one, could tell them everything they needed to know about a human being. Germany, April 1945. The first light of morning crept across the shattered rooftops like a hesitant visitor, touching broken chimneys, collapsed walls, and silent streets still scarred by months of relentless bombing. Spring had returned to the countryside, but it arrived cautiously, as though even nature feared disturbing the uneasy peace settling over a nation too exhausted to celebrate survival. At the edge of a ruined town stood an old brick school. Its windows were covered with blankets instead of glass. Its playground had disappeared beneath military trucks. The laughter of children had long been replaced by the constant rhythm of ambulance engines and hurried footsteps. The building now served a different purpose. It had become an American field hospital. Inside the former gymnasium, rows of folding cots stretched from one wall to the other beneath faded championship banners that no one had bothered to remove. The polished wooden floor had vanished beneath muddy boots, medical crates, and bloodstained blankets. Lanterns still burned despite the rising sun, casting warm circles of light across faces worn thin by sleepless nights. The air carried the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with damp wool, fresh coffee, and the faint smoke drifting through cracked windows from distant fires still burning beyond the town. Doctors moved quickly. Nurses barely spoke. Every pair of hands already belonged to someone who needed saving. Captain Daniel Carter crossed the crowded gymnasium with practiced urgency, a clipboard tucked beneath one arm and fatigue hidden behind disciplined composure. At 36, the American military doctor had spent months treating wounds that no medical textbook had ever prepared him to witness. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows. A faded wedding band remained on his finger, though his wife was thousands of miles away in Illinois. Dark circles rested beneath clear blue eyes that had forgotten what a full night's sleep felt like. Another stretcher entered through the main doors. Another patient. Another decision. Another race against time. No one asked whether there would be enough supplies. They already knew the answer. Near the far wall, separated from the patients by stacked wooden crates and watched quietly by a military policeman, sat a small group of German prisoners awaiting transportation. Most stared at the floor. Some leaned against the wall with vacant expressions. Others watched the hospital in complete silence, uncertain whether they were witnessing hope or simply another stop before an unknown destination. Among them sat a young woman, Anna Weiss, 24 years old, fair-skinned, short blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a plain gray scarf. Her worn prisoner coat concealed a simple civilian dress faded by months of hardship. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, slender fingers marked by dry skin and countless small scars that seemed oddly familiar for someone so young. She did not fidget. She did not complain. She simply observed. Every movement inside the hospital found its way into her quiet attention. A nurse searching desperately for clean gauze. An orderly struggling to calm a frightened child. A surgeon requesting another instrument before the previous command had finished echoing across the room. Anna noticed everything. She said nothing. An elderly German woman several beds away suddenly gasped for breath, clutching her side as frightened family members tried desperately to explain her condition in hurried German. An American medic looked helplessly between them. "I don't understand," he admitted. Another nurse tried. The words only deepened the confusion. The woman continued speaking through pain. No one understood. Anna lowered her eyes. She recognized every symptom, every sentence, every frightened expression. Her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her coat. Instinct urged her to stand. Training urged her to help. Reality reminded her who everyone believed she was. Only a prisoner. Across the crowded room, Captain Daniel Carter glanced briefly toward the commotion before turning back to another wounded soldier whose bleeding demanded immediate attention. He never noticed the quiet young woman sitting against the wall. He never imagined that the calmest person inside the hospital possessed the very knowledge his exhausted team desperately lacked. And before the sun reached its highest point over the broken rooftops of Germany, the American doctor who had not even learned her name would be forced to ask the one question he never expected to ask a prisoner. "Can you help us?" Sometimes, a single sentence can stop a tragedy before a single scalpel ever touches the skin. Morning settled gently over the shattered town, though little about the hospital suggested peace. The stream of ambulances had not slowed. Engines rumbled into the school courtyard one after another, their tires grinding through wet gravel left behind by the night's rain. Soldiers jumped down before the vehicles had fully stopped, lifting stretchers with practiced urgency, while medics shouted bed numbers across the crowded entrance. Inside the former gymnasium, exhaustion had become routine. The lanterns were finally extinguished, replaced by pale daylight filtering through blankets that covered broken windows. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight, contrasting sharply with the relentless movement below. Captain Daniel Carter barely noticed the morning. He had already treated 3 gunshot wounds, 1 fractured pelvis, and 2 cases of severe pneumonia before breakfast. His uniform jacket had long since disappeared, leaving only rolled sleeves, stained gloves, and the quiet determination that held the medical team together. "Next patient," he called. Another stretcher arrived. This time it carried an elderly German woman wrapped tightly in a heavy wool blanket despite the warming air. Beside her walked a frightened teenage boy whose hands shook as he tried desperately to explain something between hurried breaths. He spoke only German. The American orderly escorting him looked helpless. "I can't understand a word he's saying." Another nurse stepped closer. She pointed toward the woman's stomach. "Does it hurt here?" The boy stared blankly. She repeated the question more slowly. "Nothing." The woman suddenly cried out, clutching her abdomen with both hands before gasping. Through another stream of rapid German, the room grew tense. Daniel approached while removing his gloves. "What have we got?" "No interpreter, sir." He examined the patient quickly. "High fever, rapid pulse, severe abdominal pain." Without understanding when the symptoms had begun or how they had changed, every diagnosis remained uncertain. Daniel pressed gently against the woman's lower abdomen. She cried out again, then pointed desperately toward her upper right side while speaking through tears. "What is she saying?" Daniel asked. Silence answered him. No one knew. Near the far wall, Anna Weiss watched the scene unfold. Every word reached her clearly. The elderly woman was not describing simple stomach pain. She was trying to explain that the pain had begun low in her abdomen before moving upward during the night. Breathing had become difficult. The fever had worsened before dawn. Anna lowered her eyes. Her heart beat a little faster. She understood exactly what the woman feared. She also understood something else. No one had asked for her help. A military policeman remained only a few steps away. Prisoners did not interrupt doctors. Prisoners obeyed. The elderly woman cried out again. This time her grandson's voice cracked with panic. "Please, someone." Anna stood. Slowly, deliberately. The guard immediately noticed. "Stay where you are." Anna stopped. She looked toward Daniel instead. Her English was careful, soft. "But I understand her." Daniel turned. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at the quiet young prisoner standing beside the wall. "What did you say?" Anna kept her voice steady. "She says the pain started lower, yesterday." She touched her own abdomen. "Now it hurts higher." Her hand moved gently upward. "She says breathing makes it worse." Daniel frowned. The elderly woman nodded repeatedly, relief flooding across her tired face as someone finally understood. He examined her again, more carefully this time. The tenderness matched Anna's translation perfectly. His expression changed. "Cancel the sedative," he said immediately. The nearby nurse froze. "Sir, prepare surgery." The orderly blinked. "You know what's wrong?" Daniel never took his eyes off the patient. "I know we're almost too late." The room exploded into motion. Stretchers rolled aside. Instrument trays appeared. Water boiled for sterilization. The frightened grandson grasped Anna's hands with both of his, whispering a trembling thank you in German before following the orderlies toward the operating room. Anna quietly stepped back toward the wall, as though she had never intended to become part of the moment. Daniel watched her for one brief second before disappearing through the operating room doors. He still did not know her name. But for the first time since arriving in Germany, the American doctor realized that the most important voice inside the hospital had belonged to the one person everyone had mistaken for someone who had nothing to offer. Trust did not enter the hospital like a declaration. It entered quietly, through a door left open by necessity. The surgery lasted less than an hour, though it felt longer to everyone waiting outside the classroom that had been converted into an operating room. Its walls still carried faded maps of Europe, borders drawn before the war had torn them apart. Beneath them, Captain Daniel Carter worked beneath a hanging lamp while rainwater tapped steadily against the cracked window glass. The elderly woman had nearly been lost. Her appendix had ruptured. Infection had already begun spreading through her abdomen with the silent patience of something that did not need to hurry. Had they delayed another hour, the outcome might have belonged to the cemetery instead of the recovery cot. Daniel removed his gloves slowly when it was over. His hands ached. His eyes burned. But the woman was still alive. That was enough. For now. Lieutenant Harris stood beside the instrument table, collecting used gauze into a metal basin. "Whoever translated for her saved us from a bad call," she said. Daniel looked toward the closed door. She wasn't translating, only words. Harris paused. Outside the operating room, Anna sat exactly where she had been before, near the stacked crates, beneath the watchful eyes of the military policeman. Her posture had not changed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Nothing in her face suggested she expected recognition. That unsettled Daniel more than if she had demanded it. He stepped back into the gymnasium. The room smelled of boiled instruments, wet boots, and coffee left too long over heat. Patients slept in uneven rows. A child coughed beneath a blanket. Somewhere near the entrance, an orderly argued softly with a driver about fuel. Daniel walked to Anna. The guard straightened. "Captain." Daniel nodded without looking away from her. "What is your name?" Anna lifted her eyes. For a moment, the question seemed to surprise her more than any accusation could have. "Anna Weiss." "Where did you learn medicine?" A small silence followed. Not refusal. Memory. "Dresden Municipal Hospital." "As a nurse?" "Yes." "Military?" "No." "Civilian?" Daniel studied her face. There was no fear there exactly. Fear had burned itself out in many people by then, leaving something quieter behind. Caution. Weariness. The understanding that truth did not always protect the person speaking it. How long? 3 years surgical ward. Then emergency intake after the bombing. Lieutenant Harris had come close enough to hear. The military policeman shifted his weight. Daniel looked at Anna's hands. Thin. Chapped. Still. Hands that had not trembled when she corrected him. Hands that belonged to someone who knew the cost of hesitation. Another ambulance rolled into the courtyard, its brakes shrieking against the damp morning. Voices rose outside. The hospital stirred again. Daniel turned his head, then looked back at Anna. There were regulations. Enemy prisoners remained under guard. Civilian detainees required paperwork. Medical authority did not erase military command. But men and women were lying on cots because language had failed them. Others would arrive before noon. Some would not survive long enough for permission to pass through proper channels. Daniel made his decision without raising his voice. "Miss Weiss, I need you to translate for the German civilians." The guard frowned. "Sir, she's still classified as, I know her classification." Daniel's tone stayed calm. That made it final. "She stays in this room. She works under supervision. She touches no medicine and handles no instruments unless ordered by medical staff." Anna did not move. Perhaps she thought she had misunderstood. Daniel looked directly at her. "Can you do that?" The question entered the air with a strange weight. Not command. Not suspicion. Request. Anna stood slowly. She smoothed the front of her worn gray coat, not to look presentable, but because some old habit of discipline still lived inside her bones. "Yes, Captain." Across the gymnasium, a German child began crying as medics lifted his father onto a cot. Anna turned toward the sound. Daniel saw the shift in her face. Not eagerness. Recognition. There was work to do. For the first time since she had been brought into the school, Anna Weiss stepped away from the wall with permission. Not free. Not trusted entirely. But no longer invisible. And inside a hospital where everyone had too many wounds to count, that was the first kind of mercy. Respect is rarely earned by speaking louder. More often, it begins the moment someone chooses to listen. The field hospital settled into a relentless rhythm as the morning stretched toward noon. Every corridor inside the old school echoed with hurried footsteps, clattering stretchers, and the quiet urgency that belonged only to places where life and death shared the same narrow hallway. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight reflected from puddles scattered across the cracked courtyard, where American ambulances continued arriving beneath clouds that seemed unwilling to leave entirely. Cherry blossoms drifted across broken stone paths, their delicate petals landing unnoticed beside muddy boots and tire tracks. Inside, no one had time to admire spring. Captain Daniel Carter moved steadily between the rows of patients, stopping only long enough to examine wounds, adjust dressings, or issue another calm instruction to his exhausted staff. Fatigue lingered in every movement, yet his voice never carried frustration, only purpose. Across the gymnasium, Anna Weiss stood beside Lieutenant Harris, translating for a young German mother whose little daughter refused to let go of her hand. The child stared nervously at every American uniform. Each unfamiliar face made her grip tighten. Anna knelt until her eyes met the little girl's. She spoke softly in German. "No one is taking your mother away." The child looked uncertain. Anna continued. "They're trying to help her breathe." The girl's frightened expression eased, if only slightly. She nodded. Only then did she release her mother's hand long enough for the nurses to lift the woman onto a treatment cot. Lieutenant Harris watched the exchange quietly. "You never promised she'd be all right," she observed after the family moved away. Anna shook her head. "I cannot promise what I do not know." Harris looked at her for a moment before offering the smallest smile. "That's probably why they believe you." Before Anna could answer, another civilian was carried inside. An elderly farmer with a deep wound across his shoulder struggled against the orderlies attempting to remove his coat. He spoke rapidly, panic overtaking every sentence. The younger medic glanced helplessly toward Anna. "What is he saying?" Anna listened carefully. "He thinks you'll amputate his arm." The medic blinked. "But we're cleaning the wound." Anna stepped closer to the frightened man. She crouched beside the stretcher, speaking slowly enough that every word carried reassurance instead of urgency. "They are trying to save your arm." The farmer searched her face. "You're certain?" "Yes." "You've seen this before?" She hesitated only briefly. "Many times." The old man's shoulders relaxed. His trembling hands slowly released the blanket wrapped around him. Only then did the medical team begin cleaning the injury. The procedure took less than 10 minutes. When it was finished, the farmer reached weakly toward Anna. He did not kiss her hand. He did not salute. He simply whispered, "Thank you." She answered with a quiet nod. Nothing more. Across the room, Daniel had witnessed everything while stitching a soldier's forearm. He noticed something unexpected. Patients calmed faster when Anna spoke. Nurses repeated fewer instructions. Misunderstandings disappeared before becoming problems. She was doing more than translating words. She was translating trust. Later that afternoon, a young American orderly hurried toward Daniel. "Sir." Daniel looked up. "The German woman." He paused, searching for the right description. "The translator?" The orderly smiled faintly. "No, sir." He glanced toward Anna. "I meant the nurse." Daniel followed his gaze. Anna was helping an elderly civilian drink warm broth, supporting the tin cup with both steady hands while speaking gently enough that only the patient could hear. She had never corrected anyone, never explained her past, never asked for recognition. Yet without anyone announcing it, the hospital had begun calling her by something other than prisoner. Daniel stood quietly for several seconds. The change had happened so naturally that no one could point to the exact moment it began. Labels, he realized, often disappeared not because people were told to abandon them, but because the truth slowly made them impossible to believe. For the first time since opening the hospital inside the ruined school, Captain Daniel Carter wondered how many lives had already been shaped by the quiet woman everyone had almost chosen not to see. People reveal who they truly are when exhaustion leaves no room for pretending. Night arrived without ceremony. The last trace of sunlight disappeared behind the broken rooftops, leaving the field hospital illuminated by hanging lanterns and the pale glow of hurricane lamps placed along the walls of the old gymnasium. Their flickering lights stretched long shadows across the wooden floor, where muddy footprints crossed one another like silent records of everyone who had entered carrying hope or despair. The stream of casualties finally slowed, not because the fighting had ended, only because darkness made the roads too dangerous to travel. Inside the hospital, no one rested. Captain Daniel Carter removed his stained apron and flexed aching fingers before washing them beneath cold water poured from a dented metal pitcher. Pink ribbons of diluted blood disappeared into the basin below, carried away with the same quiet certainty as another difficult day. Across the room, Anna Weiss stood beside Lieutenant Harris, folding fresh dressings with practiced precision. Every bandage was folded, exactly the same. Every instrument returned to the same position. Every bottle placed back where another hand could find it without searching. She worked without being told. Not because she ignored instructions. Because years inside a hospital had taught her that orders save time, and time often saved lives. Lieutenant Harris watched her for several moments. "You've done this every day before the war, haven't you?" Anna continued folding another dressing. "Almost every day." "You miss it." Anna's hands paused. "I miss helping people without anyone wondering why." Harris looked down at the stack of clean gauze. There was no answer worthy of that sentence. A young orderly hurried toward them carrying a tray filled with sterilized instruments. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours. His steps were slower than he realized. As he turned beside a treatment table, the leg of a stool caught his boot. The tray tipped sharply. Metal instruments slid toward the floor. Scalpels, forceps, needle holders. Without hesitation, Anna moved. She caught the edge of the tray before it overturned completely, steadying it with one hand while using the other to prevent the instruments from touching the floor. Nothing became contaminated. The orderly stared at her. "I thank you." Anna simply nodded. "It happens." Captain Daniel Carter had witnessed everything from the opposite side of the room. It was not the speed that caught his attention. It was the instinct. Someone unfamiliar with surgery would have tried to save the instruments. Someone trained protected sterility first. There was a difference. Minutes later, another emergency arrived. An American sergeant had suffered a deep wound across his upper thigh after falling through twisted metal. The bleeding was severe enough that every second mattered. Daniel prepared the treatment table. Large artery clamp. Lieutenant Harris searched one cabinet. Nothing. Another drawer. Still nothing. "We're out." Anna looked toward an old wooden storage cabinet standing against the far wall. "The upper compartment," she said quietly. Harris frowned. "That's only a shelf. It slides." Curious, Harris pressed against the back panel. It shifted outward with a dull scrape. Inside rested several carefully wrapped artery clamps that had gone unnoticed for weeks. She looked back at Anna in disbelief. "How did you know?" Anna touched the worn wood gently. Schools built before the war often hid medical supplies that way. Daniel accepted one of the clamps without taking his eyes from the wound. Large clamp. Anna placed the correct instrument into his waiting hand. A few moments later he spoke again. "More gauze." It arrived before he finished the sentence. Throughout the procedure, she anticipated each instruction with calm precision, never moving ahead of him, never falling behind. When the final bandage was secured, the sergeant's pulse had steadied. He would live. As Daniel removed his gloves, he glanced across the room. Anna was already cleaning the treatment table before anyone had asked her to. Not for praise. Not for approval. Simply because the next patient deserved a place that was ready before suffering arrived. Daniel walked toward the small collection of personal belongings gathered from newly registered civilians and detainees awaiting transfer. Among the worn bags rested an old brown leather satchel with a faded paper tag tied to its handle. He brushed away a layer of dried dust. The handwriting slowly became clear beneath his thumb. Anna Weiss. He opened the satchel carefully. Inside lay neatly folded clothes, a small prayer book, a cracked fountain pen, and beneath them, protected inside a weathered document envelope bound with a faded blue ribbon, were official papers that would quietly rewrite everything he thought he knew about the woman everyone had first seen only as a prisoner. Recognition does not begin with applause. It begins the moment the truth becomes stronger than the label. Morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by the night's rain. Cool air drifted through the broken windows of the old school, carrying the scent of wet earth and fresh pine from the hills beyond the ruined town. For the first time in days, the artillery seemed farther away, replaced by birdsong that sounded almost unfamiliar after months of war. Inside the field hospital, another day had already begun. Lanterns were extinguished one by one. Fresh water was carried from the courtyard well. Coffee simmered inside blackened enamel pots while orderlies folded blankets before the next convoy of wounded arrived. Captain Daniel Carter sat alone at a narrow wooden desk reviewing the documents from Anna's satchel. He had barely finished reading them when the sound of a military jeep echoed through the courtyard. 2 American military police officers stepped out. One carried a leather document case. The other held a clipboard thick with transport records. Lieutenant Harris glanced through the doorway. "They're here." Daniel nodded. "I expected them." The officers entered the gymnasium with quiet efficiency. Patients looked up from their cots. Conversations faded. The senior officer removed several papers from his folder. Captain Carter? Yes. We're reviewing the civilian detainee records assigned to this hospital. Daniel stepped aside. Miss Anna Weiss is here. Anna approached calmly, stopping a respectful distance away. She stood exactly as she always had. Back straight, hands loosely folded. No sign of anxiety beyond the slight tightening of her fingers. The officer examined one document after another. You were employed by Dresden Municipal Hospital? Yes. You served as a civilian surgical nurse? Yes. You were never commissioned into the German Army Medical Corps? No. You remained at the hospital after military authorities occupied the building? Yes. Every answer came quietly, without embellishment, without defense. The officer compared her responses against the paperwork. Several long moments passed. Finally, he closed the folder. We found no evidence linking Miss Weiss to National Socialist Party activities. Silence filled the room. The officer continued. Her classification as a prisoner resulted from incomplete evacuation records during civilian transport after the bombing of Dresden. He looked toward Daniel. It was an administrative classification, not a criminal one, not a disciplinary one. An administrative mistake. One sentence. One clerical error. Enough to change the course of a human life. Lieutenant Harris lowered her eyes. Around the room, several nurses exchanged quiet glances. No one spoke. The officer handed the documents back to Daniel. She remains under temporary civilian supervision until reassignment. But these records confirm her medical qualifications. Daniel accepted the folder carefully. Thank you. The military police officers departed as quietly as they had arrived. The jeep disappeared beyond the school gate. For several seconds, the hospital remained unusually still. Then an elderly German patient raised his hand from a nearby cot. Nurse Weiss. His voice was weak. Could you help me? Anna walked to him immediately. No hesitation. No change in expression. She adjusted his blanket, checked his bandage, and offered him water exactly as she had done yesterday. Nothing about her work had changed, only the way others now understood it. That afternoon, another difficult operation began. A young American lieutenant had suffered severe internal bleeding after a vehicle accident outside town. Daniel washed his hands. Lieutenant Harris prepared the instruments. Anna stood beside the treatment table. Daniel extended his hand. Gauze. It was already there. Large clamp. Placed into his palm before he looked up. Sutures. Ready. No words wasted. No movements hurried. Only quiet precision born from years of disciplined practice. The operation stretched into its third hour. At last, the lieutenant's pulse steadied beneath Daniel's fingertips. He removed his gloves slowly. Across the room, the nurses resumed cleaning. Orderlies prepared fresh beds. Patients rested more peacefully than they had the day before. Daniel looked toward Anna. She still wore the same faded gray prisoner coat. The fabric had not changed. The patches had not disappeared. Yet somehow the coat no longer defined the woman wearing it. No one saw a prisoner anymore. They saw the nurse whose calm hands had become part of the heartbeat of the hospital. And Daniel understood that the greatest victories of war were not always won on battlefields. Sometimes they were won the moment one human being finally chose to see another as they had always been. Some people leave a room quietly, yet the room is never the same after they are gone. The field hospital began closing 3 mornings later. Not because the world had healed, only because the front had moved, the wounded had been transferred, and the old school was no longer needed as a place where strangers fought to keep one another alive. Sunlight entered through the broken windows in long pale strips, falling across empty cots, folded blankets, and faint stains on the wooden floor that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. The gymnasium looked larger without the patients. Lonelier. Crates were loaded onto trucks. Instruments were counted. Documents were signed beside a desk that had once belonged to a headmaster. Outside, the courtyard echoed with boots, engines, and the dull clatter of medical equipment being packed for the next place that would need it. Anna Weiss stood near the far wall, the same wall where she had first sat beneath guard, unnoticed by nearly everyone. The stacked crates were gone now. So were the other detainees. Only a clean rectangle of dust remained on the floor, marking the place where the hospital had almost failed to see her. Captain Daniel Carter approached carrying her old leather satchel. In his other hand was a folded strip of white cloth. Anna recognized it before he spoke. Her nurse's armband. Washed. Mended. Still marked by one faint stain that refused to disappear. Daniel stopped in front of her. Your reassignment came through, he said. Anna accepted the envelope he offered. Relocation medical service? Yes. They need nurses. A small breath moved through her. Not quite relief. Something quieter. A life reopening by 1 inch. Daniel held out the armband. I thought this belonged with you. Anna took it with both hands. For a moment, she only looked at it. Cloth should not have been heavy. This was. Thank you, Captain. Daniel nodded. Then, after a pause, he said what had waited too long. When you arrived, I saw a prisoner. Anna lifted her eyes. His voice remained steady. That was my mistake. No excuse followed. No speech about war. No attempt to soften the truth by hiding it beneath circumstances. Anna folded the armband carefully. You saw what war taught you to see. Daniel shook his head once. I should have looked longer. Outside, a driver called from the courtyard. Nurse Weiss. Not prisoner. Not detainee. Nurse. The word crossed the empty gymnasium and settled between them like a quiet verdict. Anna placed the armband inside her satchel, then lifted the strap over her shoulder. At the doorway, she paused. The room behind her held nothing now except echoes. Rain against glass. A child clutching a cloth rabbit. A private refusing help. Daniel's voice asking if she could scrub. Her own answer. Yes, Captain. She had entered the hospital as a label. She was leaving it with her name restored. Daniel stepped aside to let her pass. Not because regulation required it. Because respect did. Anna walked into the morning light. The ruined town waited beyond the gate, wounded, hungry, and uncertain, but still alive enough to need steady hands. She did not wave from the truck. Daniel did not call after her. Some farewells would have become smaller if spoken too loudly. Years later, he would remember many things about that old school in Germany. The blood, the rain, the impossible arithmetic of survival. But most of all, he would remember the quiet woman everyone had nearly ignored. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard.